My name is Ilan Goldenberg, and for those of you who don't know me, I run the Middle East program at the Center for New American Security. Today we're going to be talking about something we've been working on together for a while with our colleagues at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, INSS, as well as the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies here in Washington, which is looking at U.S.-Israel cooperation on issues having to do with China and technology. I should say this is not, the usual issues you talk about when you think about Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship. Everybody always goes first to the security bilateral relationship, Israeli-Palestinian issues, Iran. But this is an issue I think that's gaining more and more traction and importance, especially as you think about it in the broader context of U.S. policy competition towards China. Even, the State of the Union address that President Biden gave yesterday, where he stressed the importance of, sort of cooperation amongst democracies, the importance of the democratic model proving itself as the most effective governing model, and also talked about the importance of technology and leading on the most important technologies in the 21st century. So this is an area where at CNAS we've been doing a lot of work on, but usually people think about it in the context of the Indo-Pacific or Europe and things like that. But it has become more of an issue with Israel in the last few years. And you've seen it, both in some, disagreements or tensions that you've seen play out between Israel and the US as they try to work things out in terms of how they approach this issue. But also, as many of us, I think all of us believe that there's actually a huge opportunity for cooperation here. And that Israel as a democracy and as a leading tech innovator can actually be an important and useful partner in this space. And so that's what we want to talk about today. So we have with us, an excellent panel who knows this issue well. First, we have Ambassador Dan Shapiro, the former U.S. ambassador to Israel and now a distinguished visiting fellow at INSS. We have Yaakov Nagel, who is the former Israeli National Security Advisor and is a senior fellow at the Foundations for the Defense of Democracies. We have Shira Efron, who is a senior research fellow at INSS and also is with the RAND Corporation. And Martin Rasser, who is a senior fellow in our technology program, Technology and National Security program here at CNAS. So Dan, I'm going to go first to you and maybe ask you to just start by speaking a little bit about, how you see this from the U.S. perspective. And especially since I think this has become, when you were ambassador, this was probably less of an issue and has really become more of an issue over the last few years. So Dan, maybe you can weigh in on some of those ideas.
Sure. Thank you, Ilan. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm using my phone for sound because of some glitchy Wi-Fi, but I hope that's all right. It's good to be with CNAS and INSS and FDD colleagues, and really look forward to a good conversation. So I'll start with a brief story. In 2014, when I was still the U.S. ambassador to Israel, the then Israeli Minister of Transportation, Yisrael Katz, came to me and he said, look, we're going to be rehabilitating our ports, the Haifa port in particular, and we want to encourage American companies to,
Dan, I think you're muted for whatever reason on your phone.
Hi, is that better?
Yeah, I think.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
We lost you for a few seconds there.
Okay. So in the end, Israel chose a Chinese company in 2015 to rehabilitate the Haifa port. And nobody in the U.S. Navy, nobody in the intelligence community, nobody in the Pentagon called me as U.S. ambassador in 2015 and said, hey, this is a problem. We should let them know about it. Fast forward about 3 years, about 2018, and suddenly Israel was hearing all kinds of alarm bells going off from the U.S. Navy, from the intelligence community, from sorts of people in the U.S. defense community about the prospect of China being a major investor and an operator of a port in which the U.S. Navy operated. Now, I tell that story, which relates to infrastructure, and Chinese investment infrastructure has been its own source of tension between the United States and Israel relating to desalination plants, railroads, ports, and the like. But I tell it because I think it illustrates something similar that's happening in the technology sector. After the disputes that occurred between the United States and Israel over Israeli defense exports to China, the Falcon and the Harpy controversies of the late 1990s and early 2000s, the two countries reached an agreement in 2005 that there would be no Israeli defense or dual-use exports to China. But meanwhile, there was a lot of expansion over the next decade of Israeli-China trade in civilian technologies, a lot of enthusiasm for Chinese investment and partnerships in Israel. China became the second largest Israeli trading partner. Fairly advanced talks in recent years on an Israel-China free trade agreement were taking place. But of course, in that same period, the line between purely civilian and dual-use technologies has become increasingly difficult to agree on, especially in tools like cyber and AI, where Israel really excels. And Chinese investment in Israeli technology companies remains unregulated. So in that same scope of 4 or 5 years, from the Haifa port story to when Israel started to hear about it from the United States, there was the same period of increasing U.S. sense of China as this global strategic rival that is seeking to acquire other countries' innovative technologies and often to use them for aggressive and repressive purposes, surveillance, censorship, disinformation, curtailing the rights of the Chinese people, enabling the spread of those illiberal authoritarian models in other countries. And that comprehensive strategy China is known for of military civil fusion, of absorbing civilian technologies that they acquire through illicit or illicit means into the People's Liberation Army's arsenal. And of course, China also has been known to use economic investments to gain leverage over the countries in which it invests, and then use that leverage for coercive purposes. So that's that fundamental change that's been taking place in how the U.S. sees Chinese investment at home and abroad, especially in these strategic technology sectors. And so there's been an increasing U.S. expectation that allies like Israel will take these U.S. concerns into account, even if that means limiting certain opportunities. So that started really to play out during the Trump administration. Israel did create what's called a CFIUS-like review process for certain Chinese investments, but it's a work in progress. It's not in all sectors, including not really in technology sectors. It's not really enforcement. It's more voluntary, not really statutory. Many Israeli technology companies are aware of this sensitivity and are starting to be cautious about taking Chinese investment. There actually has been, for the first time, a decline in Chinese investment in Israeli technology. They're worried about losing access to the U.S. market, but there's still no enforcement on it. But Israel has some legitimate questions of its own. Washington has not yet been clear about how it defines these newly regulated, emerging, and foundational technologies under the Export Control Reform Act, and how it expects American companies and allies to handle them. And our own CFIUS review process is evolving into oversight of investments in the U.S. technology sector. So Israel very understandably wants clear guidance from the United States on its own rules, and it also has an expectation that Israeli companies will not be held to a higher standard than U.S. companies or the companies of other U.S. allies. So I think the Biden administration, you alluded to it briefly in talking about the president's speech last night, he's spoken of the need to marshal the common efforts of techno-democracies to ensure that group of countries sets the standards and the rules and the norms and develops the innovative breakthroughs rather than the techno-autocracies like China. But the United States still has work to do to establish that comprehensive set of its own rules, comprehensive set of alternatives for allies like Israel who forego cooperation with China, and to build that collaborative technological innovation framework that builds on the cumulative strengths of the U.S. and its allies and benefits them all while helping tip the balance in the technological competition with China. It's early days yet. Today's the 100th day of the Biden administration, so they're still ramping up their efforts to establish those frameworks. But as it does so, it's really going to be important to consult deeply and comprehensively with Israel to minimize friction, to maximize coordination and common understandings and opportunities, and make sure our efforts are mutually reinforcing. So I'll stop there. I know our colleagues are going to discuss some of the proposals we have for what a consultation like that might look like, how it might be structured and operate, but I'll stop there.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. And I should say, for our viewers, if you have questions, you can start populating them into the Q&A section, the Q&A box at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. I hope folks are getting me. My internet connection is going in and out a little bit. And then we'll get to Q&A in a little while. But Jakob, I want to turn to you and ask you, from the Israeli perspective, how does Israel see the China issue, and how has it, seen the past few years, where you have had some of these kind of public, disagreements or differing perspectives on these issues, and how we might sort of find a way to work together on these issues.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm really glad being here with my friends. Now, I want to emphasize that Israel, like the United States, and especially now after COVID-19, it's helping us because we have to really deep take a deep thinking and viewing of our relations with China, especially when it's connected to the United States. Now, when our relations with the United States are going on the table, and everyone knows that the United States is not hiding its positions against China, and the United States knows how to forward those positions to its allies and what they expect from them. I don't think it should be any question mark in Israel how we have to work towards China, and it's not only because the United States is asking us or advising us what to do. Maybe, as you said, we have some differences with the United States about Iran. My friend now is in Washington. Everyone is there. I think I'm the only one left in Israel. I hope that in this case, the United States will change its views now or later. But when we come to talk about China, I don't think that we have too many different opinions, especially not with me. I'm not saying that everything I think is the same in Israel. Israel should think in this order: its own interests, what its best ally wants, why and how we can do things that won't hurt Israel and our allies, and if not, what will hurt us the least. Now, I think that I wrote about it several times. I think the United States and Israel in the Chinese issues, in some cases we are too late. I think Europe is the same. In some cases, the horses already left the stable. It's not saying that we don't have what to do. Our CNAS, INSS, FDD group exactly worked on this issue, what we have to do forward, not to think about the already spilled water. I recommend, first of all, to build a gate or a wall or a barrier, so no more horses will go out. And then maybe we can give some of the horses, after we are monitoring it and controlling it, some of them can go out and eat some of the food, but really in a very secured and monitored way. I will join then the story about the Minister of Transportation in 2014. I heard first, and I didn't even know. I was a national security advisor, and I didn't know anything about this port in Haifa, because this is the Israeli law. If it's not Minister of Defense, if it's not security, if it's not defense, or if at least a dual-use technology, if it's a civilian one, it's not coming to our mechanisms, to the MOD or to the NSA or the others. I heard it for the first time when I was national security advisor, when I understood that our communication satellite just blown on Elon Musk, one of the missiles, and then I understood that there was talks about selling this company to Chinese if it were going to be working. I was shocked, but again, I don't think that the Haifa port is the most important one or most dangerous. I'm much more. I am more concerned about the underground in Tel Aviv or other things. And there are things that we can do, and others will not. I will come to it in 1 minute. Now, and it's not a bureaucracy. And I really suggest to my good friends from Israel to take the United States cautious seriously. They see the Chinese as their center rivals. They are the threatening of them. And it's the same, I think, in Israel. I think Israel should take the Chinese very serious, their ambitions to not conquer, but to acquire some of our technologies, spending small money to get big technologies, to control some of our infrastructures, even sometimes critical infrastructures, or very, very problematic technologies. There are some people in Israel, some of them, they have their own interests. They don't see the overall picture of the damage that can be caused, and sometimes they don't care because they have their own interests. It's simple, and it's important to do it. Sometimes for small benefits, Israel can have a big and huge damage. The relations with the United States, but not only. It can be damage to the Israeli interest, academy, industrial, and government level. Now, we have to understand one thing, and I'm saying it here in an open conference with the US people, Israel people, and probably others. The United States is not going to invest or cooperate with no country, and also Israel, without full security that these investments are not going to spill over to China, or that the knowledge that will be worked out in this cooperation won't be controlled and won't go finally to China. We have to understand it in Israel, in Europe, and in the world. This is the center, this is the art of the competition today, technology and other things. Even maybe Israel do not want to be in the center of this conflict, and we don't want to be part of this war, but we don't have a choice. If we want to be among the leaders in the world and to cooperate with the United States in 3D imaging, drones, AI, quantum, data science, deep learning, high-power computer, fintech, medicine, cyber, satellites, infrastructure, water, electricity, and I can go on. We want to cooperate with the United States. We have to understand there are things we cannot do with China. Now, the biggest problem, and I think Dan mentioned it, is that today it's a big blur between, it was very simple in the past. And after 2005 crisis, in Israel, we know, if there is a question, there is no question, but it's only for defense-related technologies or dual-use-related technologies. When you come to civilian technologies, no one is looking. Every regulator have its own. And when I came to the people responsible, when I was NSA, I started so-called this war. I don't know what to call it war. It was only starting. I cannot say I accomplished what I wanted, but it started, and now we have it's like firma, like CFUs. It's not good. I don't think it's right that we say it's limited. It's not technology. It's not IT, and it's still against the regulators, and it's still voluntarily, not by the law. I think it has to be wider. I think if you look on the law language in Israel, you can see it's something that it will be looked of in 1 year. I'm sure that we have to think about mechanisms. And again, in our team, CNAS, INSS, FDD, we talked about those issues on mechanisms of supplements to these investments from China, because in Israel, 15% of the investment comes from China. Some of them are okay. Some of them are very, very bad. And two more sentences about the academy. I'm coming from the academy. People in the academy, I'm telling you, I'm talking with them. They don't understand what I'm talking about. They don't understand that for $5-10 million, someone can come, say that it's not so important, it's just low-tech, or it's civilian, or it's medicine, or it's fintech. No, algorithm in AI that is working in medicine and others can be diverted very simply to defense related. And we have to understand that in China, there is no some people tell me it's against the open market. It's a private money. There is no private money in China. Everything is government-owned enterprises. So it's not an attempt to block the open market or the academy freedom. Now, this is before we are talking about the agreements between China and Iran, the ways to overcome the sanctions on oil and others. For me, as an Israeli, there is no doubt that when China will have to choose between, China will have to choose between Iran or Israel, they will choose Iran, not Israel. Yes, there is now a tension between Israel and the United States with the Iranian issue. I hope it will be solved. I'm not sure, but still, coming to China, strategic decisions cannot be done by bureaucracies and cannot be done by local interessants. Now, in this case, some people ask me, I don't think Biden is different from Trump. I think the United States, in this issue, in China, there is no change. Both of them understand that China is a rival. We have to take it into consideration. We have to understand that something should be done. And what we did in our team, I think it's a beginning of things. We have some recommendation. I'm sure it will be published. It will be go out. We have some recommendations that I recommend everyone to read and to talk about those proposals. Thank you. I'm sure there will be some questions I can answer.
Great. Well, thank you, Jacob. And I should say, we will have public recommendations coming out, I think, in a few months. We're still working on a report for folks, but are at a point where we thought it was important to do this first event and preview some of our ideas. And maybe with that, having heard, both the perspective of how, from an Israeli national security advisor and from an American ambassador who worked on this and were, from both sides, Shira, maybe I can turn to you to walk us through, at least preview some of the recommendations that we did come up with as a group. And then I think after that, we can have a broader conversation about that and also let others weigh in on the recommendations or what they thought were the biggest challenges. So Shira, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Ilan, and good to be here with everyone. Thank you. First, I'll say the opportunity to be part of this initiative and the discussion today, which I think is quite unique, and maybe we should just start with that. This group represents institutions and experts that don't see eye to eye on many Middle East issues, many issues that's concerned with Israel, and Yaakov just mentioned Iran, to say one. But what was really interesting in the many conversations and discussions we had in this group, and at least on the American side, that there was no daylight between people and experts on both sides of the aisle in the US, which I think says a lot. So I commend the participants, those present here, those that are signed on the document that we will eventually release after we share with the government officials, and everyone else who we promised to keep their names confidential, but we couldn't have done this without them. So I think the assumption and why we went into this is very clear. I think Yaakov sounding the alarm represents an unusual, very welcome, but an unusual view in Israel today. Have quite different approaches to China and consequently different approaches to the technological competition with China. On the other hand, we know that the US and Israel have great technological and defense and other partnerships which can be elevated, assuming the first issue doesn't constrain this potential. We held multiple discussions with people really across the political line, with government, private sector representatives, different think tank experts. And our assessment wasn't sort of coming to the recommendations. Our assessment was that the bilateral Israeli discussions on China and the different manifestations of China have so far been pretty ad hoc and spread across different ministries and agencies in both countries. And we believe that in order to systematically address this issue, align perspectives to the extent possible, maybe enhance the potential for technological partnership and prevent a crisis that we are all aware of happened between the US and Israel in the history, we propose that the United States and Israel establish a new bilateral interagency working group on China. Because of so many cross-cutting issues, we believe that it should be led by both countries' national security councils with different representations, and we have some specific recommendations in the paper itself at what level and who should be in charge. This big overarching working group, in turn, should be informed by 3 subgroups, and each of which should be managed at a different level by different agencies, and I won't go into the weeds on that. But the idea is that those will not be just discussion groups, right? That they would meet frequently, they would have defined taskings, and they would come with ideas, proposals, and solutions and recommendations. I will crudely divide them into the strategy group, the regulation group, and the economic and technological incentives group. So why these groups? What's the rationale? What we want them to do? I think starting with strategy, that would be the one that's most intuitive to me. And said it, Israelis and Americans think quite differently about China. I'm sure others here can expand on it. And Dan Shapiro, in his introduction, explained the view from Washington. And there's consensus in Washington, right? That China is a global strategic competitor. Some would say rival, militarily, economically, and technologically. And meanwhile, Israel, for the most part, sees China primarily as an economic opportunity. And there are many reasons for these different threat assessments. Size, Israel's very far from being a great power. Geography, it's far. Its diplomatic ties with China are less than 3 decades old. There's no Chinese Jewish population in either country. And Israel's foreign policy has traditionally been focused for very understandable reasons on the Middle East, the United States, and Europe. So China is very low, I should say, on the Israeli intelligence community priority list. Now, Israel is well aware of the US concerns, but it is our assessment that it underestimates the concerns to Israel itself, and also doesn't understand quite well why the US is so the US perspective. I think there's no expectation that Israel and the US, even after being as part of this group, would align their perspective, that they would be completely on the same page on China. But the idea is to prevent misunderstandings and to bridge some of these gaps. The onus here would have to be on the US, because we know that intelligence sharing on this issue has already improved. And that is great, but it would have to grow. The USIC would have to be more forthcoming in terms of its threat assessment. And I must say, this is not just an Israel-specific issue. Politico, the website, the paper reported just 3 days ago that in response to a memo signed by 9 4-star generals pleading the intelligence community to declassify some documents so that they can shore up allies support dealing with China and Russia. I think this is something that we're going to see more into. That brings me to the second group, which would be the investment regulation group. Both Dan and Yaakov mentioned the investment screening differences in Israel and in the US. We can't call it the Israeli CFIUS, which started in Israel January 2020, because it's quite different. CFIUS connects export controls with investment screening. In Israel, those are 2 separate things. The Israel's investment screening, in addition to being non-binding, voluntary, and all those other things that were mentioned, explicitly excludes technology. And yeah, it's high technology, but it only focuses on sectors that already have regulators in them. Now, we have to say, and this is then, I think it's taking the US, it started with the Trump administration, taking the US a long time to come to its own definitions of foundational and emerging technologies and critical technologies. But I think domestically now we can say that there is a clear understanding of what these means. However, some of the categories are still way too broad. Look at the critical technology list. It has agricultural technology, ag-tech. How can we, this is not a category. Are we talking about sprinklers or are we talking about agricultural drones? Those are two different things. The second thing is the US, and Dan mentioned this, has not been explicit about its red lines. What is sort of like in the kosher box and what is not? What do we expect our allies not to sell or share knowledge on with China? But then we come to the other side. If the US becomes a little bit more clear on those things and provides itemized lists and specific requests, it would be incumbent on Israel to address US concerns. And I don't think it's going to be that easy because Israel is reluctant to regulate technology at all, and for very good reasons. We can arguably say that one of the successes of Israel's high-tech industry, in addition to how innovative it is also that it's not regulated. But we hope that with this group, there could be ideas of how this challenge can be overcome, which brings me to the very final group, the incentives group. It has merit on its own, but especially if Israel is expected to forego some Chinese investments. So the purpose is to increase US economic and technological cooperation, which we should say is already very vast and comprehensive. And in addition, I think to different ministries, it must include representatives from the private sector. I'm sure Martin can elaborate on this because there are many lessons learned from also other countries, work that he's done on, and Dan Kleiman from CNAS did great work on this. But I think, the easiest thing is to say, well, Washington should encourage American companies and investors to collaborate more with Israel and invest more in Israel. In addition to that, I think we can talk about including Israel in different multilateral innovative forums, which Israel should be interested in joining. And also on the bilateral front, there are existing platforms today that can absorb more and be more targeted. I'm talking about BIRD and the Binational Science Foundation, which can be repurposed or maybe have sort of a channel that would be much more strategic in those areas that we would deem as nationals, in areas critical to national security. There's the OPSTEC group that's already up and running that Brad Bauman from FDD developed, but I think that's one that's dedicated more to mature technologies, and you can think of taking it to the next level and having an accelerator for early stage technologies in those areas. There are more ideas, but the hope is that a group like that would think about these creatively and make sure that it's really a win-win situation for both countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Shira. So I want to turn to Martin, and then I want to come back and we can, as we're also getting Q&As from the box, which I encourage folks to continue to throw in there. We can also dive deeper with others on some of the recommendations you just laid out. But Martin, you've done a lot of work in this space, like more globally, right? Also looking at broader, global US multilateral alliances on issues of technology. And I'm interested to hear like how this fits in with the broader American strategy, and also maybe how some of the things we're proposing, in a bilateral way between Israel and the United States, like you and I have also talked about how some of those ideas can be applied more globally, or even with other countries in a bilateral fashion. So, over to you to give us your take on that.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Alon. And it's great to be here with everyone. What I've found really exciting about this effort was that, in essence, we created an adaptable framework that is repeatable and, to your point, Alon, could be used for a whole range of bilateral relationships. There's obviously a lot of appetite within the Biden administration to create better tech policy relationships with US allies and partners, and we're already starting to see some of those initial efforts bearing fruit. So with the quadrilateral security dialogue, which is Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, they set up an emerging tech working group to start talking through some of the issues that we discussed in our effort. I think the best example of what these types of discussions could lead to is the US-Japan Competitive and Resilience Partnership that was announced just a couple of weeks ago. And here you have a really comprehensive approach tackling supply chain diversification. You have joint R&D efforts, other collaborative efforts to harmonize and align tech policy. What I think our framework can contribute to this is providing the US government a real blueprint for how to expand these relationships. There's a draft bill in the Congress right now called the Strategic Competition Act. And one of the provisions in that act is to create a technology partnership office within the Department of State. So our framework could be a very useful tool for that new office to then start engaging with a whole host of countries on these issues. And so, as Dan and Jakub and Shira had already mentioned, there are distinct differences with how various countries view technology issues, the relationship with China, the nature of the strategic competition. Our framework can help bridge some of those differences, not to achieve full alignment ultimately, but really to get countries on the same page so that they know where the differences are, and then you can figure out good solutions and how to address them. And ultimately, what I see these constellation of bilateral efforts and minilateral efforts leading towards is ultimately you want to create a true tech alliance where you have a core group of tech leading democracies really aligning themselves on some key issues. We've already talked about supply chain diversification, for example, but imagine more effective pandemic response in terms of vaccine development and other mitigation efforts. That's ultimately what we should be building towards. And I think by focusing on a straightforward framework on how to build those relationships, we can not only expand the number of players in such a tech alliance, but probably also accelerate us getting there. And I think that that essence of time is very important if you consider the urgency of getting this tech competition right. Right now, China is, arguably in the lead in terms of formulating how it's going to navigate these waters, because the tech leading democracies have been rather disjointed in their approach on these issues. We had some unforced errors in how we approached issues such as 5G telecommunications. Ultimately, the framework that we worked on, I think, would be a very good stepping stone to getting the ball rolling on more effective multilateral policymaking on a whole range of tech issues. And that I think is particularly exciting development, and one that I hope both the U.S. government and Israeli governments take action on, as well as other allies and partners.
Martin, can I ask you just one or two follow-up questions? One is, like, you've written a lot about these multilateral alliances, and there's ideas out there for a T10 and a T12. I mean, do you see Israel as potentially down the line a player or a partner in that? Maybe that's like one question I have for you. And I had another, but it just skipped my mind. So I'm just going to give you that question, and then we'll circle around, and maybe at some point I'll remember. Yes,
that sounds great. Yeah, absolutely. I think Israel is a very logical candidate to be part of such a broader tech alliance. If you consider the tremendous amount of technological capabilities and know-how that Israel possesses, it would be fantastic to see Israel being a key player in such a grouping. Just a few things off the top of my head, like autonomy and robotics. Israel's life science industry holds great potential. And Israel's also an important player in the global semiconductor industry. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to really have Israel be a part of a more concerted effort to address global chip shortages, introduce greater diversity and resilience in the global semiconductor supply chain. These are the types of things that we should be focusing on. It's not just about the US-Israel bilateral relationship, of course, but it really strengthens Israel's role in the global technology landscape in a way that I think would have tremendous economic benefits and, of course, very important national security benefits as well.
Yeah, and I should say, one of the things, I'll walk off of my moderator role for just a minute to opine on a couple of the things that, of our ideas. I think the whole philosophy behind so many of these ideas is that ultimately, if you can align the U.S. and Israel on this, there's benefits to both sides. There's benefits to, if you can align U.S. and Israeli regulatory frameworks, you can create greater, access and easier, access for Israeli companies into the American market, right? If you align U.S. and Israel technology cooperation, you can create new joint investment opportunities, things that can, that can kind of compensate also for some of the, financial losses or that Israel takes by bypassing other opportunities it might have otherwise taken. So I think that's kind of the philosophy behind all this. Not only are we cooperating strategically, but at the end of the day, there's kind of like a win-win economic benefit for all sides as well. So I'm going to start going to some of the Q&As. I'm going to mix those in with some of my own additional questions. So Jakob, I actually think I'll come back to you first, because there's a question specifically, about Iran and whether, from a strategic Israeli perspective, if the U.S., goes back into the nuclear agreement and, Israel is deeply frustrated with that, is there a possibility that Israel starts to build a deeper strategic relationship with China as a way to compete with the China-Iran relationship and offset that? And I have my own views on how realistic that is, but like Jakob, I wanted to, hear your perspective on this question.
I couldn't ask for a better question from this one to talk on my really favorite subject. But first of all, someone before said it was good that the Israeli National Security Advisor was talking. I want to make sure that I am talking on behalf of Jacob Nagel, not on the behalf of the Israeli National Security. Or again, I'm a senior fellow at the FDD, but still, it's not an Israeli official view. Even so, it's my view, and I even support it. Now, about the Iranian issue. First of all, I still think that maybe someone will come into senses and not going back to the nuclear agreement, the horrible nuclear agreement from 2015, but this is not this session. But assuming that what is going on now and the same people that orchestrated this deal in 2013 to 15 will sign in the upcoming few weeks on coming back to this agreement that you cannot come even physically to, I don't think that what you said is even it's even worth being raised up as an hypothesis, because still the United States is the biggest ally of the State of Israel, and I think now it's out, so it's not a secret anymore. Most of the biggest, I call it challenge, of the people that are now in Israel, in the Washington, Meir Ben Shabbat and Yossi Cohen and the intelligence guy, and even our chief of staff, if he was coming, and of course Ambassador Erdan and others, to tell you that we agree not to agree about the nuclear agreement on Iran, but all the others, there are so many other things. The Iran behavior in our area, the cooperation between the United States and Israel, and all lot of other things, the deepest cooperation that we have ever in intelligence and in cooperation in defense. And what just Shira mentioned, I don't, again, what Brad Bauman and Anna and me, myself, did about this joint working group, that it's even in the American law, it's not only that it's a mature technologies, or we are talking about cooperation on really, really big opportunities and challenges, but for the first time, not to look for the gaps that Israel have, and now we can use American money or so. We want to see in this working group, what are the gaps that the United States have? And of course, if Israel have the same gaps, let's join hands. Let's take the technology from both sides and work together to fill up those gaps for Israel and the United States. Now, working with China will never give us the opportunity to do it. So for very small money, maybe if someone thinks that Israel can, and again, I don't even want to say this word, but I will say it, revenge in the United States by working with China, I don't understand the way the Israelis are working. No way that someone will think, I hope so. Again, I'm not in official position. I don't think that there is some even think of someone that because what is going on with Iran, okay, let's go and work with China. No way, no way, no way. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, and I should say, like, we're demonstrating right now that, like, even though, like, somebody like me, I have a very different perspective on the Iran issue.
And I know
we can still work together on a lot of things, and the relationship itself is still strong and has fundamental, lots of opportunities for cooperation, even if we don't see everything the same. And even on Iran, we have the same objective.
You're exactly. I think this is the people in Israel coming. Look, let's agree that we don't agree about the 2015 agreement. Okay, let's continue to do a lot of other good things.
Exactly. So I want to throw this question. I'll kind of throw this question to everybody, but Dan, I might look to you first. And it's a question about sort of the Israeli private sector, and given that you're based there, and the question is, and you've also just done a lot of commercial diplomacy as ambassador as well. You did, making clear, yes, that both Dan and Jakob are former officials speaking in their own capacities. But one of our questions is, like, does this work if it's only, government to government? How do we bring the private sector in to these conversations? And, like, how do you see it, at least, how do you think, to the extent you're engaging with folks there, like, the Israeli private sector sees this issue? Maybe I'll start with Dan, but really anybody else can also jump in on this question. Shira and Jakob, I think, might also have views.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. So I would say that the Israeli private sector is well aware of this tension between the two governments, and increasingly adopting a certain amount of self-regulation. I mentioned earlier that Chinese investment in Israeli technology has actually declined in the last year or two. I think it's directly connected to the awareness that this discussion, which was taking place during the Trump administration and is continuing in the Biden administration, has taken hold among many Israeli technology companies. And their own caution, it's not necessarily Chinese caution, it's that their own caution leads them to conclude that if there's any risk of losing access to the U.S. market because of the kinds of questions that are raised when they take Chinese investment, and questions are raised. I do speak with a number of Israeli companies who, when they come and bring their technologies to the United States, especially to federal agencies, one of the first questions they get is, tell us, do you have any Chinese investment on your cap table, and what intellectual property understandings do you have with any Chinese investors? So they are increasingly very cautious about that. Obviously, it varies in the sensitivity of the technology, but I think that awareness exists, and it produces a certain amount of self-regulation. It was certainly emphasized to us by our Israeli colleagues in the course of this undertaking that there are very few instances in which an Israeli company, faced with that choice, will choose the Chinese market over the U.S. market. And so that's where some of the incentives and some of the joint technology efforts and some of the ensuring alternative investment streams can actually be helpful in reorienting them on their own desire and their own basis to make that decision to sort of steer away from China toward the U.S. We have proposed, as part of our set of working groups that Shira laid out, a private sector advisory group. There's absolutely no question that particularly the last of the three working groups, the one that is designed to enhance U.S.-Israel technological cooperation and investment opportunities, needs to be informed by those private sector groups. There's a lot of extremely sophisticated thinking in that sector. But of course, that doesn't replace certain standards that the U.S., as it develops its own and solidifies its own, should be, and we also expect in the other working group, will be working with Israel to try to harmonize as much as possible for those cases where self-regulation is not sufficient.
Yeah, and I should say that definitely is something that I feel has been a positive development as we found just the existence of this dialogue in and of itself is changing, Israeli private sector behavior, as Dan explained.
Ilan, if you wanted me just one sentence, again, the private sector.
Can I actually go to Shira first and then over to you because she also had her hand up? Thank you.
Ladies is first always.
Thank you. Good to be a lady. I just want to say that I agree 100% with everything that Dan said there. I think the public statements coming from the Trump administration had their own cooling effects. And I think that a lot of companies, high-tech companies in sectors like cyber and other were very well of US sensitivities to China even before that. And whoever can get investment from the United States or Europe, we have to say Europe is also a big player in this, would choose the US and Europe. And in fact, when we look at the numbers, and I highly recommend you reading a great in-depth report that Doron Ella did for INSS on Chinese investments in Israel, where he unpacked the data itself. We're talking now in 19 and 2020 about 7 to 10% of investment in Israel is coming from China. Now, we've seen a growing trend up until 2018. There was a peak then. 2019 was 1 year we started seeing the decline and probably had to do with the Trump administration's approach to this. And then 2020 with COVID, it's been such a weird year. So I don't think it's really not something that we can count, but we'll have to see if this trend continues. But I think we can definitely say it had an effect. The question is, in terms of the 7 to 10%, what are the strategic sectors, right? It's not just the quantity and the numbers, it's which sectors are we talking about, which Israeli entities are we talking about, and which Chinese entities are we talking about. As Yaakov said before, it's hard to say that Chinese private sector entities are really private sector. We know that there are ties to different entities of the Chinese government, Chinese Communist Party, and the PLA. And then when you look at the actual investing entities, they raise some questions. But that brings me to, another question. For 7 to 10% share that could even decline maybe, we don't know, is it worth it for Israel to fight for these investments, to maintain them? Is it really worth the risk, or is it more important to continue expanding investment and trying to get more investment from the US and Europe? Now, there is, and I think we'd have to look at this after this year, so far, the Biden administration has not been speaking about Israel in the context of China. It's been talking about different allies in Europe, East Asia. Israel has been absent from the conversation. Is this going to have a more warming effect? It's only 100 days. We don't know. Israel can become part of this conversation, but for now it hasn't been. It would be very interesting to see if this is reflected also in private sector activity or not.
So Yaakov, I think you wanted to also hop in here.
Yes, again, it's good that I'm talking about after Shira, because some of my comments also what she said. Look, I am agreeing with almost everything that Shira and Dan said, with one exception. At the end, I don't care about the quantities. I care about the qualities. I don't care that 30% of Israeli investments will be in China. I will even be glad if it will be in the areas that I want them to invest. Look, I just bought, I don't know, electricity bulbs to my home, or LED stripes to my apartment. I don't care it's coming from China. I don't care even the Chinese will invest in Israeli food chains or Tnuva or others. I don't want them to invest in, again, it's not high-tech, I don't want them to invest in critical technologies, in infrastructure, and in sensitive technologies, not only defense security, but also those that are like civilian, but they are not really civilian. So I don't care them to, I don't care that Chinese will invest in Dead Sea minerals, like cosmetics and others. So there are a lot of areas that they can invest. I don't want them to invest in transportation, in harbors, in communication, in banking, and again, a lot of other things. Now, our private sector, as they both said, it's right. They know the tensions, they know the differences, but it depends who you are. This is why I don't want to ask them. I think the government should control, should give them some regulations. Again, I don't want to call it regulations, but they have to understand what are the boundaries, what they can do, what they cannot do. And so some companies, yes, they cannot get money from the Chinese if they want to work with the United States or Europe or others. They have to understand it. The same for the academy. And there are companies, if you cannot stay on your feet without getting a Chinese money, so don't stay or go to other areas. There are areas that you are not supposed to get funds or to get support. Now, even those private sectors that understand what I'm saying, it depends what is their background or what is their overall finance view. So what Dan said and what you said and others said, if we build in our working group, and it's not only in the government level, it can be a lot of levels, it can be NGOs, it can be other. If we can work on a mechanism that someone can get those not so high investments in his ideas, not from China, in those sensitive issues, not from China, it will be very good. Of course, if it's coming to defense and security, we are not even close to China. It's not secret anymore. We should do it with the United States, with other allies. Of course, sometimes it can be Europe or even some other countries that the United States can connect us, or Israel can do it on its own, or a trilateral cooperation. We have a lot of other ways to do it, not China.
So I think I'm going to give Martin, I'm going to give you the final question here. And it's kind of, one observation I had through this entire process was, especially when we brought in folks like you and others who are, for example, experts on the Indo-Pacific and the China relationship, and is that this process that Israel and the United States are going through here is not at all unique. In fact, it is quite sort of similar to similar experiences we've had with other partners and allies. Like, we ourselves have been evolving on like what we constitute, okay economic activity versus what we see as a potential threat and problem. And many of our friends and partners in Europe and Asia all started out with a sort of economic engagement, like across the board. This is the way to bring China in, and have been evolving over time. And so, I'm just curious to see, to ask you, how does the experience you've had in these discussions with Israelis compare to, some of the other experiences and discussions you've had with European and Indo-Pacific partners, and whether you see kind of some of those analogies?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of similarities to the discussions that we had in the US-Israel context versus the discussions with Japanese counterparts, South Korean counterparts, colleagues in the European Union. Again, to Shira's point earlier, right, there's a lot of differences on a whole host of these issues. But what's important to realize is how much more unites us than divides us on these issues. And I would also emphasize that we shouldn't expect that everyone will harmonize all their policies. But what we can do is, in particular, focus on the areas where there is a need for common ground, because there is a lot of that, and focus on the areas where we share acute problems and where we have a collective interest in solving those problems in an effective and time-effective manner. Again, the supply chain issues, that's something we're all dealing with, whether it's semiconductors or rare earth elements. There are just certain areas where we are very vulnerable to Chinese dominance and coercion. So there's a very good incentive to focus there. But if you look at, the European Union, very much aligned with the United States on a whole host of issues, but issues of data governance, the United States and Europe have very different views on what the best way forward is. But what's important about the effort that we've done and other efforts that are ongoing now is to at least start a dialogue. so that we can, while we're focusing on areas where we can work together in relatively short order, at the same time, we're talking about these bigger issues where we do have differences. And yeah, we can probably close that gap quite a bit over the course of having constructive conversations, especially if we can show that we can effectively work together on a whole host of other issues. So I see this as, the first step in a long-term iterative process where we come closer and closer to not full agreement, but at least sufficient alignment that we can have consequential action that works in our collective favor, because that's what it's ultimately about, right? It has to be a win-win for all parties involved. And I think our effort is one good step in that direction. There's a lot more work to be done, of course, but I'm very encouraged by the progress that we made in the time frame of this initial phase of our working group. So I'm very optimistic about the future on these issues.
Great. Well, I think that's a great way to close it out. And I can speak, from personal experience that I think all of us have learned a lot through this engagement and have also come closer together in how we view these challenges and what we see as the challenges. And that's really the key and the point. And the US and Israel have a long history of viewing things differently and but trusting each other and having good relationships and deep professional dialogues and being able to use that to really align a lot of their policies. This is a consistent theme, I think, in the US-Israel relationship over years. And I think one we can definitely apply to this. So it's got both precedence in the US-Israel relationship and precedence in the international arena as well. So I would like to thank everybody for joining us. I would like to thank our panelists and our partners at INSS and FDD. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.